Hi, and welcome to Unco, a podcast about what's unusual in tech. I'm your host, Timothy Buck. This week, I sat down with the founder of UserLeap, Ryan Glasgow. We talked about Facebook's mistakes, blockchain, and how software companies can learn to improve their products by asking the right questions. If you'd like to help me make more episodes like this, become a patron over at patreon.com/uncofm. Hi, Ryan. How's it going?
Hey, it's going well. How about you?
Doing well. Good to have you on the show, man.
Thanks.
For my listeners, some of them may know you, but many of them do not. Can you give maybe just like a little background of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, of course. My background's in early stage startups, and I've typically worked as a product manager or a designer, really helping get companies off the ground. And I've done that a few different times now. And then I went on to Weebly as the first product manager there and really helped scale the company to around 350, 400 employees. And then recently left Weebly and starting a new company called UserLeap that helps product teams better understand their customers and collect feedback at scale.
Yeah, and that actually kind of ties into why I asked you on the show. You gave a presentation recently at a product management event about how you take user feedback and you distill that into something that's actually actionable for your company.
Yeah, I gave a talk about 2 weeks ago for the PM Fast Track group and really shared about a lot of the methodology behind UserLeap and really how the company came about and how it works. And I've really found that understanding not only the customer problem but the customer outcome is really key to building a successful product and ensuring that product really takes off and grows. And so it's been an area that I've always focused on in my career, but now I'm building a company around it and sharing what I've been learning along the way. So typically with talking to customers and collecting customer feedback, it's something that you might be sitting in front of survey software or even getting a customer on the phone. It's it can be pretty daunting. And thinking back to my past experiences talking to customers, there's just so many different directions you can take the conversation. But what I found to be particularly valuable is to leverage a framework. And when you look at a lot of the business school programs, a student might be getting an MBA, and the program is really not only about the networking but also about helping the students understand different frameworks, whether it's Porter's 5 forces or it could be SWOT analysis, so they can look at complex situations that are very convoluted and really unpack what's going on. These are really different lenses that a student coming out of a business school program could then apply to their work experiences. And so user feedback, I see a lot of similarities with just the traditional business world, and really being able to apply different frameworks to help look at complex situations and really unpack what's going on. And so, through a lot of the research that I've done, I've pulled out a few different frameworks that I really have found very helpful as starting points for each part of the customer journey. And so one example is, around acquisition. When you're looking to capture more customers, a great framework that helps you understand all of the forces at play is called the 4 forces of progress. Another example of a great framework that I've seen and really can help you look at a convoluted situation is how to optimize your product and then retain customers is called customer jobs theory. And so, when you're looking at applying understanding customers, I would always recommend people first take a step back and think about what part of their product they're looking to understand and see if there's any frameworks that they can apply as a starting point, and then dig around and leverage those frameworks to see the situation more clearly. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense, and that's something that we've even done where I'm working as well. And I've seen that, kind of like you were saying, if you use a framework like this or even multiple different ones, it can kind of just change your perspective just enough to find out exactly, to find out specific things that you can improve.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's when it really clicked for me that this could be a product, is that when I looked at these frameworks and really aligned them with each part of the customer journey, I realized that the questions and the way the feedback was collected didn't actually really vary on, per product or even per industry, that these are really general frameworks, and that if you can, they can be applied to any company, and that this can be done, and really help other companies succeed and grow, and then learn about all this knowledge and expertise.
So what are some good ways to ask those questions that you mentioned, and how do you make sure that you're asking the right questions of your customers in the first place?
That in itself is a great question. Asking the right questions. If you talk to any user researcher or anyone who's collected customer feedback, it's much more difficult than it seems, particularly on the surface. It's very easy to start asking leading questions or approach asking a question with bias, or even kind of anticipate or hope for a certain answer. And that's why it does often help to have someone like a user researcher come up with the questions, because they're not going to have any bias or often be enough removed from the situation where they're not going to really have any stake in whether the user says one way or the other. And I've seen a lot of mistakes being made though with asking questions. And one thing that never really works well that I often see, and this is probably the biggest mistake I see, is asking your users, what features to build. And that's, just asking them to vote on features, or asking them what should we build next, or really determine your roadmap. Because you really need to understand that, typically, an internet user, the internet is kind of this internet, it's kind of, it works like magic, and they don't really understand what it takes to build and develop and maintain a feature. And oftentimes they're not even quite sure, what they're hoping to achieve with your software. And so in terms of best practices, I've typically have seen that avoiding, asking what features to build works well. Also asking hypothetical questions. So asking people, would they pay for something, or would they use something? There's so many times I've asked users, would you use this feature if we built it? And then we'll go and build it, and they don't end up using it. And oftentimes it ends up with a lot less demand and usage than you had anticipated. And in terms of things to really focus on, and it's really about putting on that hat of a therapist. And if any of you have sat down and been through a therapy session, they're really probing around to understand your behavior, and talking about your past actions, asking why. The 5 whys is a great way to really drill down and understand why someone's making a certain decision. Digging into user emotions and really unpacking how they think, because as someone who's developing a product and have developed an expertise in that field, once you can understand how your users think and why they're making certain decisions, you can then take that knowledge and then apply it yourself to make those decisions of what features to build next, or how to refine and improve your product, as opposed to asking your user to make those decisions. Because what often happens is that they might end up steering your product in a direction that might not work as even they had expected.
Yeah, that makes sense. So instead of asking them specifically, like, do you want one of these 3 features, or which one do you want more, you can ask them other questions that can lead you to really an answer to that same question, but you end up being the one who makes a decision of which of those 3 features is most important. It's just based on a more informed perspective, because you've gotten these different more insights into how your user is actually thinking and using your product.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's, there's a great quote from Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, about how innovation comes from one's ability to grasp customers' unmet, unarticulated needs. And that's really what collecting feedback is about, is understanding, it's not your users you can't expect them to articulate their needs. It's really kind of uncovering what those needs are by talking to them and understanding them, even though they might not know that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And I think as like a consumer of technology, at least on Twitter, it's funny because like a lot of people on Twitter complain a lot about Twitter or complain a lot about Apple or complain about some technology company, and a lot of times I feel like the we kind of assume that Twitter is just going to like do what we ask them to do, but like a good example of this was like upping the character limit. I know at least when they upped the character limit, the people I follow were all upset about how like bad of a move that was and how it was going to ruin Twitter. And then just like a few months passed, and I think like I haven't heard anybody complaining about it. I've heard several of those people say, actually, I was wrong. Like this is better. I'm enjoying it more. And that's an example of one of those things where like a lot of the users thought this isn't going to be a good thing, but the product managers at Twitter made this decision probably based on a lot of research and a lot of, insights using some of these, using some of these different frameworks that you mentioned earlier to like decide to make a big move that was going to make, press around the whole world. And a lot of people were going to talk about it and were going to say it was a bad decision, and it ended up being a really good decision.
That's definitely a great example. And, the team probably was able to dig into, what the problems were and how people wanted to communicate on Twitter. And then, like you're saying, see that, there's a deficiency specifically with the character limit.
Yeah.
And then expanding that would unlock, a lot of those problems that they're having.
Yeah. And what's interesting is I believe the product manager, or maybe it was like the director of product or somebody at the time, wrote a whole piece about why they made this decision. And it was exactly what you're talking about. They had like all of these, they were showing that in countries that have smaller, that didn't run into the character count, like in Japanese and Korean and Chinese and stuff, where a character expresses a whole lot more, that people tweeted more there, and that they interacted more in those, like the average user did, because they weren't, and the hypothesis was because they weren't worried about hitting that limit and having to like edit their tweet down and spend time editing it to fit each time they tweeted. And so that was like part of their hypothesis. And they wrote a big long thing about why they actually did this and the data they'd actually already collected to inform that decision. I thought it was super interesting.
And I've definitely sat there on Twitter, looking to refine something I'm looking to say and cut as many words out so I can come in under the limit. Right. So I can, I've felt that pain there of not being able to get a tweet out because of that limit.
Completely. Especially several years ago when like links counted and all that stuff. It was crazy. But yeah. So what do you do once you've, asked all of these questions? How can you parse through this information that you've gotten from all the different types of users that you have?
In terms of, digging through it, this is something that's also, can be really challenging because you're looking at all this open-ended raw responses. And even if you do multiple choice, you could see oftentimes a pretty even distribution across responses. And so one of the first things that I found to be really helpful is segmenting by the outcome. And a lot of products, you look at a product like Twitter, where, you could segment their own audience with different outcomes. You could have a business looking to promote themselves. You could have an individual who just wants to, read news and follow specific topics as a consumer and really consume that information. You could have, an individual who's looking to promote themselves. And each of these people, they want different things with the Twitter product. And so instead of looking at all their feedback, really lumped together, I found it helpful to really start off any time you're interacting with customers to ask them what is the desired outcome with your product. And so with Twitter, by asking and understanding, who is a business looking to sell more products or promote services, as opposed to an individual who just wants to consume information, I always recommend segmenting by the outcome. And so that way you can actually pull apart and separate these different audiences because they're just going to want different things. Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. And I think if when you're building a product, you're not thinking about the different outcomes that your users are looking for, then you may solve the problem for one of them just fine. But it's oftentimes we miss out on what different segments of our user base, want to do, or don't even know that don't even know that they're missing, because we're not thinking of like what they're actually trying to do with the product. I think it's really valuable advice.
Mm-hmm. And another helpful thing with that as well is that a lot of times you get a lot of noise in the data because you're getting people who are not necessarily your target customer, and they could end up filling out your survey, or potentially you end up on the phone with them, and if they're not really one of your a part of your target customer, outcome, then they could really end up distracting your the feedback you're looking to collect, that could end up taking your product in a different direction that you weren't hoping for.
Oh, right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You don't want somebody who isn't really, a customer that you're even shooting to have, and they're like, you need to change everything. But well, the reason that you need to change everything is because I'm not, we're not the product for you. But
exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. What are some ways that you can optimize your product for these different segments?
I've always found it really helpful, and I've seen a lot of companies do this now, where they start to measure they start to have a lot more customer input as a metric. And so traditionally, when you're looking at a lot of the tech companies, they'd measure things like revenue and monthly active users. But I was on Facebook a little while ago, and they had actually a prompt appear, and it actually asked me in a format of a survey whether I agreed with their mission statement and how effective their product was at achieving their mission statement of making the world more open and connected. And they asked, do I strongly agree? Do I agree? Do I somewhat agree? Do I not agree? And I've seen a lot of value in actually measuring different aspects of customer sentiment, because you can really track that over time and see if your product is helping your own customers meet the objectives that they want. Because a lot of times, if you're looking to grow your overall revenue, you could end up focusing on that metric and taking your product in one direction, but it might not necessarily always help to serve your customer better. And so just ensuring that those two metrics, the business metrics and then the user goals, monitoring those over time and ensuring that those are moving up to the right is just really important, because once you start to lose track of your customers, that can really end up having long-term negative effects. And I think we're seeing that with Facebook right now, where they focus so much on the openness of the data, serving advertisements, and it ended up really hurting some of their retention and usage, and some of their long-term metrics. And so now that in January they announced that they're pulling back on that, and they're actually running ads saying that we're gonna care about our users more.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really interesting that they've been so successful, but it's almost because they were focusing so hard on something that was, I guess, somewhat directionally correct. Like it led to success because they did really well at that thing, but it also was because they lost sight of their customers and lost sight of, I guess some could argue lost sight of what they wanted, what customers wanted. It has led to these negative impacts. But I guess a second question on that, how do you think that all the stuff that's been in the news lately will affect Facebook? I noticed that like in their most recent quarterly earnings report that they still grew last quarter. Like their daily active users and monthly active users and all of that still went up significantly, despite all the delete Facebook campaigns and all that stuff that was going on. Do you think that this is just like a blip on a radar, or do you think it will over time this like privacy concept will be negative for them?
I certainly think it's going to be a negative, and it'd be interesting to see, at what point it really kicks in, because typically when a user is going to switch to a different product, it typically is not an overnight decision. And when you look at a product like Facebook, it's been around for, 10, maybe longer. It's been around for quite a while now. And as individuals, we just have so much data locked into that product. It's not a product I'm going to switch to something different tomorrow.
Right.
And so but it has really worn down. And I think, the perception, the user perception has really started to drop. But it's really, people won't switch until there's something that achieves that same outcome better.
Right.
And so until something else comes along, people will continue to use Facebook. And I think that's why they're not seeing any effects, is because it's still the best product at achieving that outcome of helping users connect with friends and family.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes sense. But do you think that this has opened the door for a potential future competitor?
I certainly see a lot of potential here. And I've seen, a few launches lately, on Product Hunt and, TechCrunch about more just decentralized social networking where users own the data. Whether that's the right solution, I think is, up for discussion, but it certainly leaves open an opportunity for someone else to come along. But until something else comes along, I don't think we're seeing much of an effect.
Yeah. Those ideas of a decentralized network, like they've been every couple of years, they come back around, and I think the idea is good to a certain extent, but they never have that product experience, that like they don't provide the same level of value as these other services do. I think that is not the fact that they're like centralized or not. It's just that the people who've started those companies haven't done a good enough job of actually meeting the customer need to be a valid alternative.
Yeah, and these are certainly platforms, and I've seen some of them where they're asking you to set up a server.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so, I think as, for most people, that's going to be, a bit much in terms of signing up for a new product.
Yeah, I think that's like Mastodon or something like that. It's like a Twitter competitor that's been around for a year or so, and it's like that. Like you serve your own stuff. I don't know. It's kind of crazy. I don't think it's going to catch on. But do you think it's even possible for a company, for a decentralized system to meet the need in the same way that a Facebook does? Because Facebook does have all of that data, and they do have, because of all that data, they have really effective advertising that leads to a lot of money to invest in. Instead of just A/B testing a page, they can A through Z test a page on all their users, any feature over and over again, and make it as as effective as possible. Is there even really an opening there because of that data gap?
I think it's going to be really tough given the platform that they've already achieved, and I think it's 2 billion.
Yeah.
2 billion users now, on that product, and it's just continuing to grow. And so when I look at the decentralized networks, I just see the switching cost is too high at this point, and I'd be surprised to see any really gain meaningful traction. And I think if there is something that's going to come along, it's just something that helps connect users in a different way, whether that's, virtual reality, augmented reality, different ways of connecting people, maybe an interest graph that, serves, because Facebook really hasn't evolved as a product very much in the past 5 years. And so I think it's going to come down to really the innovation, but something that is still centralized.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you there. But it may be interesting if a company does come out, even if it is centralized, they may be able to still, capitalize on the mistakes that Facebook's made and the negative, press that they've gotten by, I guess, just making it really, really clear what they're going to do with your data, and just becoming known as a competitor that is, keeping your data more secure, and they can still take advantage of that even if it's a centralized system.
Yep.
I think it's interesting. So sort of a tangent here, but some of my friends have suggested that really the only way that any sort of like regulation that were to come from the government would actually just entrench Facebook even more, because of like basically adding a moat around them. If social media type companies had to follow more strict rules, it would be harder and harder for a startup to come in and build something that truly competed with Facebook, because they'd also have to hire lawyers and all that stuff to make sure that they were meeting all of these new requirements that could theoretically be added to Facebook. What do you see as the best way to prevent a company like Facebook, or any company that's just massive like that, from becoming a monopoly? Whether that do you think that's even something that we need to do, or is that what do you think about that?
I definitely see the benefits of duopolies or just having multiple players in the space. And I think the government was a lot more aggressive throughout the 1900s. I haven't seen anything recently. They're really just letting companies figure things out. But when you do start to have a company like Facebook and it does become a monopoly, I think they do start to take advantage of the users.
Yeah.
And so certainly see a lot of disadvantages at this point, because the user just has diminishing power when we don't have other options.
Right.
And it puts us in a tough spot, because even though there's all these privacy and data breach, not necessarily breaches, but the really the sharing of all the data. But if we don't have another option, then like we just chatted about, we're going to continue to use these products.
Right.
And so it's tough though, because they're able to really acquire anyone who appears to compete in any way.
Right.
Whether it's they're I think there was a startup they just acquired that they saw it get a little bit of traction, and they just bought it for 50 million, just in case, or WhatsApp. They're seeing WhatsApp really emerge in emerging countries, and decide to, just buy the company. And so at a certain point, I do think it makes sense for the government to step in and ensure that there is competition, because otherwise, if they do stay a monopoly, it's going to be really tough for the users to really have any say on what products we use when there's only really one choice.
Yeah. I think I agree with you. Have you read Stratechery at all? Do you know who Ben Thompson is?
I do. Yeah, I'm a casual reader.
Yeah. So some of his points, I don't have it in front of me or anything, but he made some good points about how really kind of like the antitrust laws from the last century was they were for a different type of business, and it's going to be really, really hard to apart from maybe some of the acquisitions they've done, it's going to be really, really hard to like get any software based company to define them as a monopoly the way that it was written before, because the way those laws are written, because you can just go to another website, right? Like technically there are other things that you can use other than Google or other than Facebook. But in reality, there aren't, right? Like there's not really somewhere that's going to meet that same need that Facebook meets, or the same need that Google meets, because of the amount of data that they have, and the amount of like for Facebook in particular, the amount of people that they have using on their platform, that the number of connections that you've made, like it's going to be really hard to, if tomorrow a new I don't know, like a new Facebook competitor was started with all of the same exact features as Facebook, it still probably wouldn't succeed, because that network effect of, it's only useful if when you message somebody there, you can actually message your friends and family on there. And getting all 2 billion people, or at least the 1,000 people you care about, moved over all at once is going to be a really difficult proposition. And one thing that Ben mentions is from Stratechery is that he would suggest that if the government does come up with some sort of regulation, that it should be regulating that your network is transferable in some way. The way that, maybe even the way that like Twitter, the Twitter network was transferable to Instagram. Do you remember that?
How you were able to import your followers into Instagram?
Yeah. So it ended up being really nice, because even, I believe it even like updated you as your followers joined Instagram. Like it was like a live sync basically. So, as people joined who were following you on Twitter, you would get a notification for Instagram, like, hey, this new person's here. Do you want to follow them? Or, it worked really well. And Ben's argument is that that's really the only way to, it ended up being a really dumb decision by Twitter to do that. Because Instagram's doing really well, and obviously Facebook owns them now. But what do you think of that concept of like regulating by requiring these companies to basically give up one of their most valuable possessions, which is this network effect that they've built over the years?
I think any way to give the user more power is really going to, let us take more control, and if I was able to take my network from Facebook and transfer it elsewhere, it certainly puts a little bit more responsibility on Facebook with, caring for the data that I, am giving them, and, what they know about me. And, they might make decisions differently. They might, be a little bit more responsible about, how they share their data and who they share it with, because for the users, we do often care. And if, we did have a way to switch to a different network and bring, our network with us, then, that I think it's really going to ensure that, they're acting a little bit more in our best interest.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's an interesting concept because every company is trying to create some sort of lock-in. Like you don't want, whatever your business is, whether it's software or not, like you want your users to, you want to be as sticky as possible for your users, and you want them to stay and continue to either pay you or, keep using your product, so that like Facebook does, so that more ads can be shown. But at the same time, I think there is a line where some of these companies are so massive and have effective monopolies that a concept like this that gives the user, like you said, like gives power back to the user, could be really, really valuable.
Yep.
So I always end up the show with the same question. What is one thing that you find unusual in tech right now?
Unusual in tech.
It can be anything.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this one. Something that I'm finding unusual in tech is that I'm seeing a lot of technologies really emerge, like blockchain, and I'd say blockchain is a great example, where there's a lot of potential, but a lot of companies and individuals, even and startups, aren't really approaching building solutions with having a problem in mind. And so a lot of times I'm hearing about, can we apply blockchain to X or to Y, whether it's social media or banking or, different forms of, sharing online, and it's really taking a technology and applying it to sometimes problems that don't exist.
Yeah.
And companies are raising fundraising and teams are forming around applying these technologies. But in terms of looking at the history of tech in San Francisco and San Jose, I can't say I've seen that, because it does typically start with some form of problem or some form of building something with the customer in mind. But this seems like we're really getting ahead of ourselves as an industry of trying to force a square peg into a round hole in some of these situations. And so I'm following closely to see what happens of it, and certainly optimistic, but I wonder how much of these will actually turn into commercially viable products.
Yeah. No, I think that I completely agree with that point. I mean, I think people make the connection back to the .com boom maybe a little bit too easily, but I do see some comparisons that can be made there, in that there's just so much capital and there's a lot of investment in these technologies, because it can turn into something. It has a whole lot of potential. It could turn into something really, really, really big. Like, blockchain is a very interesting technology and kind of changes a lot about how the internet works. But like you said, I don't know if it's necessarily being connected to real problems yet. And do you know of do you know of any blockchain technology startups that you've seen that really do have a problem that they're trying to solve, that is a clear problem for users?
For blockchain, not on the top of my head. I'm sure there are some, and I'm really excited about the technology. But I would love to just see some of these companies more focused on what are real problems that individuals or companies are facing, and then really seeing how that could help, as opposed to really looking for having a technology in search of a solution. And it reminds me a little bit of academia, where a lot of times you're building you're developing new technologies, and you're just seeing what works and doesn't work, and then after ad hoc looking for solutions. But typically that's a pretty high failure rate. And so I'd love to, if there is one out there, I'd love to read about it and follow their story closely, and really wish them the best.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an interesting tech, and over the next half dozen years, it has a lot of potential. So where can people find you on the internet?
I am on Twitter, and so you can find me there, working with alternating characters now. My Twitter handle is Ryan Glasgow, RyanGlasgow. And UserLeap, the company that I'm starting, we're currently in beta, looking for and continue to onboard customers. And so if you're a web app and you're looking to improve your product and grow your revenue, sign up at userleap.com, and I'll follow up with you and see if there's a good fit for you to use the product.
Yeah, definitely. We're actually using it at my company. We've signed up to be a beta testers as well. So
yeah, looking forward to have you guys use the product and hearing your feedback.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, and I'll link all of that in the show notes. And you guys can find me on Twitter at TimothyBuckSF, and you can find more information about the show and the show notes over at unco.fm. Thanks for coming on the show, Ryan.
Thanks for having me. It's great chatting.